Okay. Can you hear me? Good. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to start out with a quick survey just to get a sense of your gut feeling. And the two questions, or the question is, which A or B do you lean towards? Do you think that we, meaning us humanity, are basically on the right path? That we are more or less adequately dealing with our human-made problems? Or B, do you think that we're basically not on the right path, that we need to make basic changes, and that focusing our problem solving on the negative symptoms is not really going to improve our situation? Who leans towards A? Okay, and B? About 50-50. Okay. So, imagine you're on a sailing boat with a bunch of other people, and you're sailing through beautiful coastal waters. But every now and then, there's a breach in the hull, and water starts flooding the boat. Now, repairs are made, and also buckets are used to empty out the water that flooded the boat. But over time, these breaches become more numerous and they become more severe. Now, you might think that it would be a good idea to investigate that. But the others on the boat are totally preoccupied with improving the buckets, making larger buckets, improving repair materials or techniques. And it didn't end very well. That boat is now a popular diving site. The amount and complexity of negative effects that we are facing are a direct consequence of our current technology culture. In other words, the way we invent and use technology has a significant influence on amount and complexity of human-made problems. If we want to improve our handling of technology's negative effects, we will have to make changes to our technology culture. Or else we'll just keep on fighting symptoms after symptoms, endlessly so, trying to contain the worst, but with no real progress made. And to figure out what these measures might look like to improve our technology culture, to improve the handling of our negative effects, we must first look at the basics of our technological development. And the first aspect, basic aspect of our technological development I'm going to introduce is one you're surely all familiar with: extraordinary increase. For that, we need to take a few steps back, actually 2.5 million steps back, to a time at the earliest members of our genus. And one fine morning, perhaps one of these members had this epiphany, this idea to invent something, to invent the first stone tool. Actually, this wouldn't have been the first stone tool. These are pretty advanced stone tools. I just felt they look really nice, almost like pieces of art. And by the way, the word technology comes from the Greek word techne, which also means art. So let's look at what happened from that first stone tool until our time. On the vertical axis, we have number and complexity of technologies, and on the horizontal one, we have time. And we'll start out, as I said, with the advent of our genus Homo, and with that first stone tool, very low level of complexity, and we'll look at the first 500,000 years. BCE is before current era. And what happened during those first 500,000 years is pretty much nothing. And we'll fast forward to the next 500,000 years, and there's still nothing going on. And then the next 500,000 years, that could be a better stone tool. And then we'll fast forward to the beginning of our species, about 250,000 years ago. The next 100,000 years, still not much going on. And then the next 100,000 years, this could be, say, the invention of the bow and arrow. And then 10,000 years ago, we have the beginning of something rather significant, namely the beginning of agriculture. And you might be thinking that I'm totally exaggerating with showing this development of essentially 2.5 million years to be pretty much flatline. But in comparison with what has been going on since the beginning of the 18th century, since the beginning of industrialization, it actually is pretty much a flat line. Because this explosion in number and complexity of our technologies completely, utterly dwarfs anything that came before. And as we all know, there are a number of pretty dramatic problems that have been building in these last 250 to 300 years. Energy consumption is still going through the roof, population sizes are increasing, resource consumption, destructive power of our weapons, human-caused species extinction, human-made toxins in the environment, human-made greenhouse gas emissions, or tools to micromanage whole populations, and so on. Now, of course, it goes without saying that there are many advantages that came with this development as well. But negative effects are the other side of the same coin. You can't have one without the other, which leads to the next basic aspect, which are negative effects. Now, if negative effects are a basic aspect of our technological development, of technology use, then why are they such a problem? And the short answer is that they're not per se. After all, our genus, and particularly our species, are pretty much defined by technology use. There has always been a mixture of advantages and disadvantages. But in our times, negative effects are becoming an increasingly existential problem, not just for our species, for us human beings, but for many other life forms as well. And the reason, I'll get right back to this, and the reason for that is that the exponential increase in number and complexity of our technologies is mirrored by an exponential increase in number and complexity of negative effects. And I was going to use this slide before, so quickly backtrace. We don't have perfect knowledge, and so we don't have perfect control. Therefore, negative effects are an inevitable outcome of technology use. So the question here is, how long can we keep this up? Or maybe the question should rather be, are we keeping up? Which leads to the next basic aspect, which is divergence. And here again, we have our exponential increase in our technological development, and there's a second graph that is also increasing exponentially and represents our human capacity to deal with that development. And on the left side, you see that these two graphs don't overlap, and they never did, because there's always a time lapse from when you introduce a tool, a technology, even the simplest ones, until you go through a learning curve and you learn how to best manage it. Because even the simplest tools, lastly, are a form of complexity, and you introduce them into our environments, and also environments which are infinitely more complex, and also the complexities of us as human beings and how we interact with each other. So, for instance, just imagine when the first tools were invented for fire making. Surely there was a kind of a learning curve you had to go through to prevent your environments being burnt down every time you start a fire. So even back then, there was a learning curve, there was a gap. Now this gap is increasing, and as I indicated before, it is being filled with more and more, and also more severe negative effects. Now there's a reason that this is happening, that this gap between created complexities and our ability to manage them is widening. And the first one that I personally think by far is the most important one is that we're moving way too fast. Our speedy, rushed paths to technology innovation and technology use, these half-baked approaches, and the economic and political interests that are driving these rushed approaches, it is not surprising that we're missing many issues and that some of these issues are going to be big ones. A next example of why this gap is increasing is that there are far too many things going on simultaneously. There's 1,000,001 things going on in all these different science and technology areas. And again, I think if we spread ourselves so thinly, it's not surprising that we're going to miss many issues. And again, some of them are going to be big. And the last example of why this gap is widening is the extreme lever of huge populations and still growing populations. Even a tool or technology, which clothing, by the way, I would consider also a tool or technology. If we take, for example, fleece fabric, and I only read about this a few weeks ago, when you wash these fleece fabrics, say a fleece jacket, these are essentially microfibers, microplastics. Part of these microplastics, they wash out and they come into our water systems. And the estimate now is that there's the equivalent of 7 billion fleece jackets in our water systems, and at least as much in landfills because some of it gets filtered out. And we are just about figuring out how damaging plastics are in the environment, how they seep into the environment, how they get into the food chains, and so on. So something as insignificant as a piece of clothing, if you multiply it by billions and billions, you might have a big problem. The next basic aspect is the one that we're moving towards technology's dominance. Imagine that you were completely dominated, completely determined by a phenomenon. You had no choice, no freedom. Now, if you were completely determined, dominated by a different phenomenon, obviously there wouldn't be any difference because the key issue here is that you're being completely determined, completely dominated. Now, if you were to be determined by two phenomena, and you even had a say how much influence each of those have in a given situation, then you have choice, then you have some flexibility, some freedom. And ironically, I think that is kind of what is happening because we moved away, our earliest ancestors moved away from being completely determined by natural circumstances. And with more and more technology, and certainly so with this incredible increase in technological saturation, we're now in danger of moving towards just a different kind of dominance, a different phenomenon that will be completely determining our circumstances. So the more we focus on technology, the more we surround ourselves with technology, the more we let technology influence or even determine aspects of our lives, the more our minds will be filled with that kind of thinking, and the more likely it is that we can only envision technological solutions to our problems. And that will make this move towards technology's dominance more probable. Another aspect contributing to this move is that there is a kind of self-logic to technology's development. It's not a coincidence that the first tool or technology invented was not a nuclear power plant. You have to go through chains of causality. You have to go from A to B to C to D and so on. And that's what I meant by this image of Skittles or M&Ms or whatever they are. Now, if we just always pick up the next possible piece of chocolate or whatever it is, if you go from E to D and so on, E to F and so on, then there is really no choice because we don't know why we shouldn't pick up the next piece of chocolate, why we shouldn't go to the next number or to the next letter in the alphabet that offers itself up. So we need different criteria. We need to know why we wouldn't go along with something, or else we're just chained to this development, chained to the self-logic of this development. And I think that's the last basic aspect example of a basic aspect that I want to present, and I call this one the Paracelsus Effect. And it's one that concerns an aspect that goes beyond the assessing and comparing of advantages and disadvantages. And Paracelsus, that's who actually grew up very close from here, the famous Renaissance doctor, he once said that everything is a poison and nothing is a poison, that only the dose makes something to be a poison or not. I'll give you a couple of examples, perhaps. Let's say a wine. You might be totally excited about the qualities of wine. however you would describe it, that it's the taste and it's organic and socially responsible and the packaging is environmentally friendly. All these qualities that many people would agree that is an advantage. But if you drink 4 or 5 bottles of that wine, there will be objective negative effects, regardless of how amazing that wine is. Or think about water, for instance. We are totally dependent on water. If we don't drink water, we die after plus minus 3 days. But if you drink too much water too quickly, you will die because your body will be flushed out of electrolytes. So even something as essential as water, there is too much of it. So how does this apply to our technological development? Again, we have this move from nature's dominance to technology's dominance. And through adding technology into our existence, through increasing technological saturation, we gain very basic things. I'm not now talking about actual advantages of a specific technology, but more like macro advantages. We gain the independence I was already talking about, diversity, choice, food security, for instance, or the comforts. And at some point, that growth rate starts to decrease. Surely you know all about bell curves. And at the very top, an additional unit of technology, an additional step in technological saturation will not give you an additional advantage. And I call that the defense line because we don't want to slip past that line. We don't want to go slide down that slope towards technology's dominance, where each additional technology will actually decrease your overall level of advantages. An example could be, for instance, a street system and cars. Cars have these certain advantages, right? But at some point, if you add more and more cars and the street system becomes more and more congested, then each additional car will take away of the advantages that cars have or might have. So the question, of course, is where are we on that bell curve? And it's also a question to some degree of opinion, but I think we're already pretty far up. Which leads to the next section, the question about what can be done. And before one kind of tries to answer that, one needs to ask oneself, why even do something? Because, for instance, in the beginning, some of you felt that we are on the right path. And this question of why do something is connected to this one. What are we human beings? Are we exclusively technology focused? Now, actually, this is also in a way a basic aspect. Namely that up until very recently, technology developed outside of our bodies. And now technology is moving more and more into our bodies, which just really puts even more focus on this question, are we exclusively technology focused? And I'm fairly comfortable saying that most of us would agree that we're not, that we are about much more than just technology. And of course, we're not just about positive or beautiful aspects. There are also negative ones for sure. But the point is that tool invention and making is just one aspect among many. We are obviously biological beings and social beings. We're cultural, psychological beings, spiritual and intelligent beings, and surely one could make up other basic aspects of our human essence. And on the right side, you have possible expressions of these basic aspects. And this isn't about knocking great inventions or the people that enabled these great innovations. They should get the recognition. But we shouldn't put the inventions or the innovator on this pedestal and dance around them like a golden calf, because it distorts our view of technology, it distorts our view of this development. And what we need now is a really very sobering look at what is going on, because the idealized look is not going to help us. So what would a technology culture look like that doesn't create more than it can manage and that protects freedom and diversity? I kind of indicated it before that speed is such a central aspect why we're not keeping up. if we don't slow down, we don't have the time to figure it out. A second one is that we need to change your driving motivations. I didn't have time to get into that too, but they're basic, very basic human motivators, for instance, curiosity, and they have been greatly instrumentalized and leveraged over the last few hundred years, and therefore they contribute to this unsustainable speed in our technological development. And a last important example of what a technology culture would need to look like that doesn't create more than it can manage and protects freedom and diversity is that biology and technology need to be in balance. And I put biology in quotation marks because it should symbolize anything that is not technology. An example for this could be our resources that we're pouring into technology and technological development. And I don't just mean, for instance, financial resources, but I also mean our innate human resources, our time, our energy, our attention, our creativity, or our ability to cooperate. If we don't put at least half of these resources into everything that is not technology, we will be slipping down that slope into gradually slipping towards a total technological determination. How can we personally contribute? Just very quickly reflecting on these last 3 points. It all begins also with ourselves. This has nothing to do with suggesting that we, should not use technology or should not further develop our technological capabilities. But we need to also start slowing down our own personal technologization. It's a bit of a mouthful, this word, but I think it shows nicely or expresses nicely this gradual move to having more and more technology in our lives. So perhaps if you take on an additional piece of technology, think about where you could do with less or with even no technology. And also that balance is to seek it in one's own personal life. And I'm not suggesting that you here are like that, but if you assess the amount of time that you're really engaged with technology in your waking hours and you come to the conclusion that it's pretty much all the time, maybe that would be a good moment to try and put some other aspects into your life, some that are not technological ones. For instance, the last point, that you live out some cultural aspect. I was just a few weeks ago, I passed someone on the street who was singing to himself. And my first reaction was a little bit, well, that's strange. But then I remembered that when I grew up and I'm probably about a generation older than you are, when I grew up, people, I wouldn't say they were constantly singing outdoors but it wasn't unusual to meet people that were singing. And you might think that this is maybe a silly example, but I think it's a very defining aspect of our humanity, and I will just be curious to see how many of you this year have sung with other people. Okay, there are a few. Very nice. So, is this all just utopian, wishful thinking, idle talk? I think not, and I have some quotes perhaps to back me up. This one is from Lord of the Rings, you might know it. For those of you who are not familiar with the story, Frodo is a character who gets this impossible task that he doesn't really want but feels obliged to take on, and he says, I wish it need not have happened in my time. And his friend, the great powerful sorcerer Gandalf, says, so do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And the next quote associated to Buddha is similar, that we are shaped by our thoughts, that we become what we think. And the last quote, this one from Noam Chomsky, reads that if you assume that there is no hope, you guarantee that there will be no hope. If you assume that there is an instinct for freedom, that there are opportunities to change things, then there is a possibility that you can contribute to making a better world. Now, luckily, I don't just have quotes to back me up. We have very significant changes in our recent history where If you would go 50 to, let's say, 100 or 150 years before these changes, and you would talk about these potential changes to people, they would think you're crazy, or they would not understand what you're talking about. So every idea, it takes an evolution, it takes a development, and then suddenly a change appears possible that before seemed absolutely impossible. The abolition of slavery, 100 years before it, people have said it's impossible. We depend on it. It's a pillar of our economic systems. Or women's suffrage, women's voting rights. In the early to mid-19th century, even many women were not in favor of equal rights. So the main takeaway, I hope, from this little presentation is that our technological development is not predetermined, that we do have a lot of influence on it, and that influence that we can exercise will have a great effect on how damaging or how beneficial the further development will be. Thank you. Just one more, actually 2 more points. If you're interested in more of these thoughts that I've been making, I brought the book I wrote. It's both available in English and in German. It's also available online at voluntaryenslavement.com/book. And the second point is that I'm starting this initiative, a broad societal response, to shed some light on these very basic problems of our current technological development. And there's a piece of paper here. If you're interested to hear more about it and perhaps even participate, it would be great to have some students on board as well. So I think now we have the Q&A part.
The slide says our technological development is not predetermined.
Right.
And I have a question which follows from this. Do you think the technological development is forced by the design of our economy?
Just to be sure that I understood the question, you're saying whether technological development is forced on by the economy, right? So yeah, it definitely is. I mean, there are huge amounts of funding that go into various technology areas, and once a technology or company proves it has a market, and then we all know how these angel investors, and then the first institutional rounds, and so on, and then the IPO or being bought up by a larger company. Yeah, it's definitely a very big driver, and an issue in this, why it's such a big driver, is also that we don't have real cost trueness. So if we take an obvious example, our environmental effects, right? So all of these companies that are producing technologies or technological processes that also produce environmental effects, their products don't have to cover the true costs. And so you have these market distortions. One example that often is mentioned is that if nuclear power plants actually had to ensure the worst case scenario, you couldn't use nuclear energy, and that is true for many other things. Another example would be, for instance, when you have these genetically modified plants that now are creating resistances in the environment. How do you want to assess what the costs of these resistances are, especially in the long run? These companies don't have to carry these costs because our legal framework doesn't force them to. So yes, I think there's a very unhealthy and unnaturally high amount of resources of economic interest driving this development.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I had a question. What current technological trends worry you the most?
There's so many of them, right? You have, nanotechnology used to be hyped. It's a little bit less of a hype right now. Robotics, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, new kinds of energy generating technologies. So there are many trends. What I am personally most concerned about is genetic engineering, because many effects, even environmental effects, with time, you can kind of reverse, right? Even though it seems like some of the effects that we're unleashing, like global warming, it's not very conceivable how easily we could reverse it. But In genetic engineering, there is a model of what genes are, and many scientists say that this model of the static idea of where you have these molecules on the genes and what they do, that it's completely outdated, it's not true. But it's still the basis, and because there have been all these billions flooding into genetic engineering, there's a huge pressure to kind of monetize these investments. And we see it in various companies that are pressing for absurd patents. Like there was this one, I think it actually was Bayer, that pressed for a patent of a chimpanzee that had a slight genetic modification. They wanted to own that chimpanzee. It's, in my opinion, it's absurd, and I think it's very dangerous because this is a crazy ride that we absolutely have no idea how that will reverberate through the environment and what it will mean for our human society. So that's the one that personally I'm the most concerned with right now.
You mentioned the genetic engineering, and I'm interested about that because in the society we live in, we don't have that much natural selection anymore, and due to like the random mutation and the human genome is slowly degrading. Like people who wouldn't survive like 200 years ago now survive because we have like better technology. So for example, people with like type 1 diabetes can live quite a normal life. People with asthma. So now if we don't have natural selection and people with like these like conditions can like reproduce because like we cannot tell them like not to, isn't like genetic engineering the one like ethically acceptable way how to prevent the human genome degradation in the long run? Because like either we can introduce natural selection, tell people who have some issues not to reproduce, or just like artificially fix it. Or so, which of these three you think we should use, or we should accept the human genome degradation, or if you know about some other possible solution? So I'm asking since you mentioned that, and I'm really curious about that.
Well, yes, it's true that obviously through all these medical advances, we have greater longevity, and as you said, various conditions now are treatable or manageable for these people. And you mentioned that these forces of natural selection are now not really applying anymore, which, as you said, degradation of the human genome. I think that we really need to take a few steps back, because what I'm hearing is that you are seeing a technological solution to this problem. But this problem is also a result of technological solutions. And I can't say that there is absolutely no aspect in future solutions that would contain genetic engineering. But what I'm talking about is something more basic, and I think we really need to look at that more basic problem, because if we just continue like a knee-jerk reaction to look for technological solutions to problems that, if we think about it, are really the results of our previous technological solutions, then we're just in an endless vicious circle, and it's just going to get worse and worse. And for someone who says, well, I don't kind of agree, I would ask that person, how much more evidence do you need that things are not working out? I mean, the environmental problems that we have, say global warming, are the results essentially of technologies that are already way over 100 years old. Of course, we've perfected them further, but burning fossil fuels is well over 100 years old. And that's the time lag of a simple technology, the one that we understand the consequences fairly easily because, it's getting warmer, or islands are being flooded, or whatever. But what are you going to do once there are manipulated genes that suddenly spread through the population, and then a few generations later we see there's a big error in that? What are you going to do? Are you going to update these human beings? So I think that of course, this is not a 0-1. We can't just halt everything and say, now we have to think about it, and once we thought it through, we could continue. But what I'm saying is we need to put a lot more effort into thinking this through and to thinking about what are the real basic issues and not just continue endlessly, because in principle, we're not doing anything different than our ancestors that invented a better spear or a better stone tool. We are still innovating and then using those technologies that we see an advantage in. That's our basic approach. And that needs to change because it's not adding up. Does that more or less end? Good, thank you.
I don't know whether you already thought about it this way, but I have a feeling that some technologies are only invented because people don't know that we already have a solution for the problem. For example, like with water-repellent clothes, some people say that they have to put plastic in them, but there were already water-repellent clothes in Renaissance time in Italy. So how do we ensure that knowledge doesn't get lost and people can find solutions that already exist?
How do I ensure that knowledge doesn't get lost? I'm not sure I understood the question. In what sense that, how do I make sure that knowledge isn't lost?
Know that people don't forget about solutions that already exist.
Well, I think some knowledge always gets a bit lost. I don't know, for instance, this is maybe a stupid example, but most of us cannot make fire with very primitive tools, even though that was at some time a knowledge that most human beings knew of and that would help them to create fire, to create warmth, to create cooking opportunities. But I mean, all in all, and especially in the last few hundred years, I think there's very little knowledge that is getting lost, and that is a very important factor in the speeding up of the process. I don't know, a quote comes to mind by Isaac Newton, who once said that the reason he saw further than others is because he stood on the shoulder of giants. So I don't think that a lot of knowledge gets lost. Or maybe I misunderstood the question.
I just have a feeling that a lot of knowledge gets lost, probably because I have studied a lot of older technologies.
Right.
Especially in the field of textiles, because I think what you said, that microplastic in the water is a big problem. And I hear a lot of people who say that there is no solution or there was no solution, which I think is just wrong. So I assume that a lot of people don't know how they did it like 300-400 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something that just I was just thinking of a knowledge that has been lost, I think, and it's perhaps not so much a technological knowledge, but it is the knowledge, the sense of our environments. And a few generations ago, most human beings had that because well over 80% of people were working in agriculture. And I think that's a knowledge that has been lost because we're not connected to it. We live lives that are essentially shielded from these circumstances. And I think that would be an example of a very consequential loss of knowledge because it's difficult to be concerned about something that you don't understand. And so I would say that, yes, that would be an example of a significant loss of knowledge. And this would go too far, but I think that part of the solution is, because also industrial agriculture is such a problem, that part of the solution is that far more of us need to go back and work in agriculture, need to understand the basics of our circumstances. So hopefully that can be regained, at least in part.
How would you propose that we as humanity should implement this philosophical or ethical framework and who holds what responsibilities in that regard? Like government, universities, like who should do it?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. The question about ethics, about values, lastly. And the way I see it is that our governments are lastly a reflection of our system right now. They are not going to lead the way, because generally governments don't lead the way to a different kind of system. They are the system. And I think that this discussion about ethics is very important, and that it's not nearly taking enough place amongst us. There's like in Switzerland, there's an ethics commission which does, for instance, deal with questions of genetic engineering, but they are not really changing the debate. They are, and that may seem a bit unfair, but they're mostly just rubber stamping what is happening anyway, and they're trying to guide it in a legal way that doesn't create too many problems. So where would this revival of the value discussion and where would it come from? And it's kind of funny, when I started occupying myself with this topic, at some point, and even though I'm a completely non-religious person, I started realizing that there's a very basic aspect at the core of this problem, and that is what I think is a spiritual void in our culture. And to me, spirituality is not, as something mysterious. I think the way I understand spirituality, it's a very logical outcome of our brains, in a sense that we recognize ourselves. Who are we? In what relationship do we stand with our natural environments, with other life forms? We see the depth of the night sky. What is that? What's our place in all of this? Is there a consciousness behind it? These are all fairly logical questions when you try to become aware of your environment, and that's the basis of spirituality. And then on that you build ceremonies, rituals, mythology, and all that stuff. And that kind of goes back to what I was trying to answer your question, that I think this disconnect that we have from our natural environments is a big driver in this fading sense of spirituality, this fading sense of connection to other things than just me and now. Because our environments and really looking up in the night sky gives you a sense that there's so much more going on, and that forces you to pay attention to other values. So I think it starts with us, what reason, what values would make you not use a technology? So to really think about that. And another perhaps example where I think we are on a very slippery slope is with genetic sequencing and prenatal diagnostics, where there is this tendency now to have abortions for fetuses that are said to have this and this probability, to have this and this condition, which again kind of goes into what you were talking about natural selection not taking place anymore, and that we are driving our own evolution. We are driving our own revolution. Look at our track record. It's insane, And just to put some meat on the bone in regards to this example, I don't know if some of you have ever spent time with people with Down syndrome. And I'm not trying to embellish that condition, and it's not easy for those people, and it's certainly not easy for the people that have to take care of them. But if you spend time with these people, and I have, it's amazing how infectious their outlook is, their energy is, their positivity is. And so when we now say that this is not life worth living, I think that's very, very dangerous, especially considering that this is just the beginning. We still have a tendency to look at this problem from a much too static point of view. We need to look at the dynamics, this hockey stick curve. That's the reality. And where we are now, where are we going to be in 50 to 100 years? In 50 to 100 years, in evolutionary time span, is nothing. So long answer, but I think it starts with us. We can't delegate something this important to a government, to authorities, to someone else. It's something very personal that I think each and every one has to think about on their own.
Okay, we have another question right here.
Would you say this exponential increase in innovation results from a surge in a sense or of a purpose in life? Like we always search for new things, we work on new things. Do you think this corresponds to what we see now, this increase? If we wouldn't increase our innovations, like what would we do else? What would our purpose be if we wouldn't innovate or create new technologies?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. Very good also because it reflects our realities. I totally understand where you're coming from. And as shown, technology always has been a part, even of our genus, 2.5 million years, and certainly of our species. So it will remain an important part, as well as technological development. But I think this overfocus on technology is such a problem because we need to consider the evidence that it is such a problem. And if you personally think that it's not such a problem yet, then I would urge you to think, at what point would you think it's such a problem? And once you see that we're approaching that, you could then perhaps see also that those of us, all of these thousands and 100,000s of people, because of this overfocus on technology, are now studying various science and technology areas and are going into technology companies, that this needs to somehow be scaled back because it is unmanageable. And as I said before, I think it's a very important possible vector of how to counteract for now that these people are asking what should they do, is that we need to go back. We need more people working actually in our natural environments, working to provide our foods, to know the circumstances. We went in the early 18th century, there was something like close to 90% of our populations working in agriculture, and then came mechanization and so on. And now in Switzerland, there's something like 2.5% to 3%. And I think that's a big driver that we are treating our environments the way we are treating them, because the vast majority of the people are clueless about what's going on. They might have heard of that industrial agriculture is a problem, but they don't really know the specifics. But if you're in it and working yourself, then you understand it, and you're also much more likely to be concerned about it and to take care. And then also that could be a big a good way to stop this technologization of agriculture, because you might have heard of permaculture or what's the other term? I forgot it, but they're different. There are different modern new ways of thinking to come to move away from industrial agriculture, but they're much more labor intensive, which I think is a good thing, because then it offers opportunities for people that are looking for different occupations, and that will also make the price of food more expensive, which I totally think it should. We are spending much too little on these very basic ingredients of our lives. And again, that cheapness has a cost, as we know. And that cheapness is not sustainable. So does that answer it somewhat? Good, thank you.